Hello my friends, I am Jean-Michel Grosjeu and welcome to my third opinion video. These are videos where I try to think about gaming as best as I can. And above all, where I try to spark a discussion about games that make me dream, immersion games. And then, after two previous videos, which I invite you to watch if you still don't see what we are talking about, some of you asked me to provide some examples. Yes, it's all very well to talk about storytelling, about games that tell a story, but what kind of games are we talking about? So here it is, my top 10 immersion games. Actually, don't get me wrong, I've called it a top 10 to keep things simple, but it's more of an immersion games directory. And to be honest, as you'll soon realize, I've cheated a little because there are not 10 games I'm going to present you, but 10 categories of immersion games. Immersion games, you're beginning to get the idea, are games that tell stories. So, my 10 categories will correspond to 10 different ways of telling stories. In fact, I'm not interested in how the game works or its rules, and especially not the mechanism it uses. No. What I see is that different games allow you to create and live different kinds of stories. And that's how I'm going to present them. 10 families of stories you can live with games. And of course, needless to say, this list is 100% Jean-Michel Grosjeu's selection. There are surely plenty of other immersion games as excellent as the ones I'm about to present, but first, I have not played them all, and there are plenty I don't even know about. And second, when it comes to storytelling, everyone has their own tastes and you may not share mine. But that's the way it is, this is my top 10. Okay, let's get started, and before discovering my first choices, don't forget to really enjoy what follows. My only selection criterion is the quality of the stories you will experience while playing these games, the quality of immersion. So let's start category number 1. This category looks like a bad narrative game cliché. An author wants to tell a story, so he takes his players and leads them through his story, the one he created for them in advance. It's the principle behind all choose-your-own-adventure books. And yes, in this kind of stories, players can make choices and the book offers several possible endings. But it's not the great freedom you dream of, and players' role is finally to choose between 10 or so stories, 10 or so possible endings. And since it's interactive, you fight battles, you throw dice, it's still more lively and often more immersive than a novel. But in the end, it all comes down to the same thing. As a player, you're living a story that's been written by someone else. These are called paragraph-driven games. And you might guess from my slightly cynical tone that these are not my favorite narrative games. In fact, I like paragraph-driven games, but I prefer when the author focuses on creating a universe, some characters and some bits of story, just enough story to set the scenes, and then leaves it up to the players to live their own adventures. And then, under this condition, we come across much more interesting games. Still with paragraphs, but not too many, and the best of this category is with no doubt Dungeon Degenerate by Eric Radé and the incredibly talented artist Sean Ehrberg, a game published by Goblin Co. in 2017. A game in which players are degenerates, as the title suggests, locked up in the jails of the fortress of Brutalburg, the capital city of the Wurstreich. You take on the role of a witch smeller, for example, or a pumpkin-headed killer. There are 28 characters to choose from. And then, right from the start, the warden of your prison cell asks you to go and dig up a mummified head that he buried outside town and cannot retrieve by himself. He asks to dig it up and deliver it to his cousin, who is hiding in Pigskeenport, a den of dangerous, lawless thugs. And the guiding principle of this incredible game is that from that point on, you can do whatever you like. You can accept the guard's offer and do as he asks, but you can also vanish in the countryside of the Vorstreich as soon as you are out of your cell and go off on your own adventures. Or you can dig up the mummified head, but keep it to yourself in case it has any evil powers. And why not try selling it to Gutfish Ford, the Toadman's village on the edge of the Great Swamp? The possibilities are endless, and the game constantly offers more and more outlandish open-ended options. And that's not even mentioning the creatures you'll meet: the Cock Goblin, the Waste Witch, the Tooth Taker whose special attack is pain, and above all, the Sex Dwarf that has made this universe so famous. Goblin Co. has published small booklets detailing the history, geography, politics and culture of the Vorstreich, and even if you compare it to novels or movies, frankly, I don't know of many universes this exciting. After taking a step back from total zaniness, we can find in the same category the Too Many Bones saga by Josh and Adam Carlson, published in 2017 by Cheap Theory Games. In this case, the adventure is reduced to a series of battles, but always well staged so that they feel different with a variety of challenges and settings. As, for example, when the characters are lured and captured by bearded dancers and must do the fight in chains. It's fun, a little cartoony, and the sequence of battle scenes ends up forming a small campaign that lends an epic feel to the Gearlog's journey. And let me close this category with a hidden gem from the 80s, Ambush, a game by John Butterfield and Eric Lee Smith, published in 1984 by Victory Games. Set during the Second World War in France, you find yourself at the head of a few men faced with a blank map and a more or less clear mission: take possession of a building, patrol in the fog, or even try to bypass an enemy position by river in a canoe. And from there, with a clever system of paragraphs triggered by a sliding ruler indexed on the hexagon's number, the scenario throws up a number of surprises and plot twists. You're attacked by dogs as you cross a fence, a friendly plane crashes 100 meters away from you and calls for help, and I won't spoil it any further. It's much more scripted than the two previous games, but the hexagonal grid gives a real sense of freedom and immersion is gripping. Okay, and you can see that all games in this first category are cooperative games. And in a way, it makes sense. This game's narrative has been imagined by the game's author, so their challenges and antagonists are written in advance. Now, if we want to free ourselves and our imagination even more, the next step is to do away with all these paragraphs and let players evolve as they see fit, in a completely open world. Are they friends or enemies? Should there be a winner at the end of the game? In fact, it doesn't matter. What counts is the story we are going to live. And here is my category number 2, I should say, the king of all categories, sandbox games. So obviously, this is where I bring out the holy grail of immersion games, Richard Hamblen's Magic Realm, a timeless monster published in 1979 by the Avalon Hill Game Company. And I say monster because it is one of the most complex games on the market with a rulebook that scared off many players. In this game, each player takes on the role of a character from the Magic Realm, a witch, a black knight, or a woods girl, lost in a maze of plains, caves, and misty mountains, haunted by legendary monsters with their treasures, sacred places, and even troops of warriors or amazons or rogues with whom you can chat, bargain, or even make common cause for a few days. Magic Realm doesn't tell a predefined story. The game sets the rules for its world, and then it leaves you to find your own way, to live your own story. You can tame bats, turn into ethereal gas, or pick up a flying carpet to rise above the fray. This is the kind of game where you quickly forget about victory points. What matters is not who wins, but what adventures emerge from the player's misadventures. It's a game where you can cooperate or fight each other. A game where players are completely free to choose their own morality. Gunslinger, a game by the same author, published in 1982, 3 years later, by the same publisher. A game about the conquest of the West. From Billy the Kid to the Gold Rush, from Mexican desperados to Sioux warriors. The game begins with a scenario that sets out the situation, the stakes, and the character's objectives. And then, before you know it, you're forgetting about victory points and entering the scene. The scale of the game is very different from Magic Realm, since we play a single action scene, almost in slow motion. It could be a Mexican standoff, where just 6 outlaws are standing around a bag of gold, or a more complicated brawl in the middle of a saloon. And what happens in the few seconds of real time that the game lasts is incredibly rich. You really feel you're in the shoes of these characters. You can do whatever you want. And you feel the danger and death that awaits you at the first shot of a Colt 44 or a Winchester. Obviously, there was a golden age of sandbox games in the 80s, and even our French author Bruno Feduti created with Pierre Cléquin a delightfully surprising game, Baston le jeu qui craint, which in English gives something like Rumble the game that sucks, published in 1985 by Jeux Actuels. In Frank Margerin's graphic universe, the players are small-time punks fighting in a suburban bar using bicycle chains and other helmeted headbutts. Their goal is to find a drunk guy's car keys or to protect the bar from a gang of burglars from the next neighborhood. And like the 2 previous games, Baston is an open game, a sandbox game, where you can do whatever you want. A guy gets up on the table to attack your best buddy, you can tip the table over to knock him down. The set is completely interactive, from beer bottles to pinball machines. You can block an opponent in the toilet or smash his head with a door. You can even, if you have no honor, go to the phone booth to call the cops. In short, Baston is a very fun game, not serious at all, but a rich and dense game able to generate the most memorable stories. And if you think that these games are from a bygone era and deserve to be forgotten because you know modern games are so much better, obviously I disagree. But I'm still delighted that last year, in 2023, a brand new splendid sandbox game was published, Stationfall by Matt Eklund from Ion Game Design. A game in which you play as a chimpanzee, a telepathic rat, an overarmed pirate, or a frozen corpse, all trying to evacuate a space station that's falling to Earth. The game is more streamlined, there are victory points, and in a word it's more modern to the point it might appeal to Euro gamers. But its universe is incredibly rich and creative, with players inventing new tricks every time they play, and it's always a pleasure to play it again and again, with the role of someone else, the ship's AI or some robot lawyer. Next category, this time we focus on the simple confrontation between 2 characters, or a very small group. These are dueling games, and the story these games tell is reduced to a single scene, the duel. Screenwriting schools teach that a fight scene must be thought out and told as an entire story, with a beginning, developments, and a final climax. And that's exactly how great dueling games also tell great stories. You don't need a host of characters or a setting the size of an entire country. The iconic game in this category is BattleCon by Brad Talton, who is also the game's publisher through his company Level 99. And what sets this game apart from all other card games is that the duels it tells are carried out by real characters with strong personalities, with a story, and even personal goals and stakes. And every card we play, because it's a card game, every attack we make has a meaning for that character. Let's take Marmelie as an example. Born from a dragon egg, she is a magician, and despite being mainly pacifist, she wants to rid the earth of the deadly influence of her mother, the evil dragon queen. Naturally, Marmelie uses magic to fight. She's not a warrior. Her spells are powerful, but they require concentration. So, during the duel, she will try to avoid blows to keep her mind focused until she can petrify or pierce her opponent. Then, there's Trius Blackwind, the wandering bard. He's a storyteller who sings the tale of his battle even as he is living it. Instead of striking a blow by playing the strike card, he will prefer an epic strike, and better than that, a truly epic strike from the heavens. And of course, he must hit, because his fight has to live up to his legend. The more he does, the more he sings, the more powerful he is, but the more he raises the stakes. Not to mention Kay, the strange blob, who loses matter like snail slime over the course of the fight, and who must from time to time pick up all his slime in order not to lose his consistency and be able to finish the fight. Each character has an ultimate desperate move, their so-called finisher, which they can play only at the end, when they've built up enough power and which ensures unforgettable climaxes and plot twists. And so, yes, you can play this game like any other card game, building combos and counting hit points. But you can also listen to what the game has to say. You can immerse yourself in the booklets that come with it and let yourself enter its universe. A universe so rich that Brad Talton has extended it to a whole range of games. And that's how you can find Marmelie Greyheart in Pixel Tactics, another excellent fighting game by the same author. And they are all here, Trials Blackwind and Kai the Gelatinous Blob. Even better, the same Brad Talton has released a dexterity game, a flicking game, Disc Duelers, which is also an excellent dueling game and features our Princess Marmelie. It can sound mundane, but it is not, because it gives a fantastic depth, the illusion that this coherent world exists independently of the game you are playing. So I like dueling games, but there's a subcategory of dueling games, or a supercategory, I don't know how to call it, that I like even more. That's vehicle duels. Let's call them dogfight games. It's more or less the same pleasure than with duel games, but extended to new contexts. And the first context that comes to mind is aerial duel. And the iconic aerial duel game is Wings by Samuel Craig Taylor, published in 1981 by Yakinto. Look at this gorgeous illustration, it's Dream in a box. And then, flying my SPAD 13, a French plane, SPAD stands for Société pour l'Aviation et ses dérivés, I tried to escape the legendary Red Baron, a Fokker triplane piloted by von Richthofen, the ace of aces, the pilot with 80 victories, or, at the head of a small squadron of Sopwith camels, I tried to stop a Zeppelin bomber that has just destroyed a hangar close to my airfield. Wings is a hyper-detailed game where anything can happen. You could lose control after a bad shot, or your plane could catch fire, or your pilot could faint, or your machine guns could jam, or all of the above at the same time. Planes twirl, loop, barrel roll, Immelman spin, swerve. You can do it all, but depending on your aircraft's capabilities. If you want to play Wings, you've got to love tables and figures, the positions of all your weapons, the characteristics of the engines, and how to handle your plane as a function of speed and altitude. In short, after reading your manuals for a few hours, you'll really feel like a pilot of the era, and your duels will be memorable. And if World War I and wood and canvas planes aren't your thing, there's a more modern version, the Fighting Wings series by J.D. Webster, whose latest opus, Wings of the Motherland, was published in 2019 by Clash of Arms. The goal of this series is to simulate all the aircraft that flew during the Second World War, an impressive piece of work that may interest you for its academic value alone. You don't even need to play it. But then, what great fun to take the controls of a Corsair fighters, as in Black Sheep Squadron, and set off on a mission over the Pacific Ocean. And if you have trouble picturing 3 dimensions, because this is the true difficulty for aerial games, you've got Close Action by Mark Campbell, published in 1997 by Clash of Arms. Here you play as Nelson at Trafalgar. We are in the 19th century or the late 18th, and I hear you saying, what does this have to do with aerial duel? They share the same category because they tell the same kind of stories. In both cases, it's still dogfighting. They are sailors instead of pilots, but they watch each other, they hesitate, they close in, and they attack. And here again, the game is a very precise simulation. Which sail for which wind? Should the cannons be loaded with cannonballs, or chains to break the mast, or with grape shot to prepare for boarding? And then we can move away from this sad reality of war and start dreaming a little with Car Wars. I'm talking about the 1989 edition. Beware, there are a lot of different editions, not all of them excellent. A game by Chad Herbie and the famous Steve Jackson, published by Steve Jackson Games. And now look, it's Mad Max on your table. It's still dogfighting, but the vehicles are cars. And not your everyday mundane sedan, but some customized monsters from a post-apocalyptic world where you fight for every liter of gasoline. And not just cars, but vans, semi-trailers, motorcycles, sidecars, each heavily armored with heavy weapons, not to mention oil projectors or paint projectors for your opponent's windshield, blades for pedestrians, and the list goes on. There are dozens of expansions. This game is endless. And it comes with Uncle Albert's From Hell catalog. You understand that this is not for serious players. Because half the fun in Car Wars is the hours you spend designing your vehicles before the battle, only to lose it all on a wrong move after a few minutes. And I won't close this category without mentioning the absolute monster of dogfight games. The point of no return where you wonder if you've gone too far. I'm talking about Starfleet Battles, created by Stephen Cole and published in 1990 by the Amarillo Design Bureau, a game from 1990 but still in print today with new supplements coming out all the time. Starfleet Battles is the great space combat simulation game. This time, you play at the USS Enterprise against a Klingon destroyer. And looking at the game board, you could think, fine, it looks simple, just a few ships meeting and shooting at each other. But first, situations can get a little more complex, and even worse, the Starfleet Battles rules are not just game rules. They are huge binders, several hundred pages of rules that needs to be read like the technical specifications of these 23rd century ships. Starfleet Battles is a game that changes your relationship with game rules because, of course, you don't have to read everything in order to play. If you're playing with the USS Enterprise, for example, you only need to know how the equipment of that particular ship and your enemies works. So, Starfleet Battles is more than just a game. It's a universe whose rules you read just for fun before going to bed, just to think for a moment before turning out the light that a rack of F-type Klingon drones can load more drones but runs the risk of chain explosion if it's hit through its shield. Well, as you may have noticed, with dogfight games, we've stepped into the world of war games. Because yes, you cannot talk about immersion games without at some point talking about war games. So far, the stories we've been telling with games from the previous categories are the stories of one, two, or a handful of characters. And it's always easier to identify with and immerse yourself in a story when there aren't too many characters. And so, to make a smooth transition, the first wargame we are looking at right now doesn't stray too far from this principle. It's Sherwood, a game by Buxeria and Martin Crowell, published in 2022 by Historic One. In this game, we play as Robin Hood and his merry men, or the Sheriff of Nottingham and his soldiers. In other words, we play in an imaginary world we already know and already familiar to us. One token equals one man, easy to identify with, and so in a classic scenario like this one, we live a small adventure involving a dozen or so people, an episode from Robin Hood's great epic, the attack on a carriage by his merry men. Fine, but Sherwood in fact is the introductory version of a much larger system that began with Gary Chalk and Tony Webster's Cry of Oak, published in 1981 by Eurogames. By and large, Cry of Oak tells the same kind of stories, small battles in the Middle Ages. A bandit raid on a village, a peasants' revolt put down by neighboring lords, with extension to play the siege of large fortifications, or even the famous story of the Seven Samurais in medieval Japan, or a night attack by ninjas. And so Buxeria, a fan of the series, decided around 2013 to relaunch the series in the form of what he called the Norman Saga. Same game, slightly more modern rules, and still stories on a human scale, a group of soldiers try by force to prevent a wedding, or a small army tries to storm the castle of a local lord. If we allow ourselves a little hate, here is Men of Iron, a system of 4 games, soon to be 5, dedicated to the reenactment of medieval battles. Yes, I'm particularly fond of that era. Games by Richard Berg, a true Mozart of wargaming, published between 2005 and today by GMT Games. In these games, one token represents 250 men, so of course, you feel not so close to your men anymore, but this scale makes it possible to relive entire battles. Agincourt, the Battle of Crecy, Marignano, or even the Battle of Bannockburn in Scotland, the final battle in the film Braveheart. And this game is great for 2 reasons. First, because it's very historical, and personally, for example, I plunged into books about the 100 Years' War and William the Conqueror because of this game. Men of Iron is all about historical accuracy. The Agincourt scenario, for example, states that the French player has very little chance of winning, because that's precisely the reality of Agincourt. The poor French knights, overwhelmed by events, bogged down in the mud against the relentless lines of English longbows. And I can guarantee that once you have played the game, you've learned your lesson. The story of the pride of the French knights, overwhelmed by the modernity of English tactics. And you've learned the lesson because you were there. And then, if we go back even higher, we come to the legendary battles. Waterloo, Gettysburg. Battles involving over 150,000 men. This time we are no longer talking about little stories, but big historical pictures. Both battles are covered by very similar games. The La Bataille series for the Napoleonic Wars, a series by Ed Wimble published by Clash of Arms, which has been around since the 80s and is still evolving now. And the Great Battles of American Civil War series, a series by Richard Berg, him again, which has been around since 2001 and is still growing. Playing these games is like running a marathon. As well as learning a great deal about military history, you're plunged into the heart of the furnace. You understand the chaos of these great battles, the impossibility of sticking to a set plan, the role of chance, the coup de théâtre, but also the importance of strategic talent, the need to react quickly and make the best use of your remaining forces. In short, you'll come away from this kind of game with vivid memories, great visions, but above all some glimpses of this or that local fight and so many images that will come back to you when you read books on the real battle. 1,000 times better than a Ridley Scott movie. With these games, you understand what these great generals did, why they did it, in what context and with what constraints. Next category, let's stay in the world of war games for a little while. Because we've understood that this game can teach us a great deal, bringing to life great historical events in a way that no history book can. And that's all very well, but it only works with strict military history, the reenactment of great battles. And we'd like to enlarge our historical horizons. In great conflicts, it's not just the clash of arms. There are also politics, economics, public opinion, and fortunately, some games can simulate this very well. Card-driven games. Since Mark Herman created the genre in the 90s, there have been tons of card-driven titles on the shelves, but I'd like to single out my 3 favorites here: For the People, Empire of the Sun, and the highly acclaimed Path of Glory, the first 2 by Mark Herman and the third by Ted Racer, all 3 from GMT Games. These games cover, respectively, the American Civil War, the Pacific War, and the First World War. They are strategic games that embrace the entirety of their conflict, and the famous cards in Mark Herman's system are the fuel for players' decisions. Basically, these cards represent the administrative and military power of both sides, and they do it in the simplest way, with a small number that the player uses to perform actions. And so, the great thing about card-driven games is that, instead of this number, the player can always choose to perform the event described by the card. And what does this simulate? Well, it simulates the fact that while a great general, you the player, is trying to deploy his strategy in the field, other decisions are being made by politicians, by the society, or events are occurring that are beyond his control. And then it is his role as war leader, your role as player, to judge whether to exploit this event or not. In For the People, for example, Gideon Welles, the Minister of the Navy, proposes a program to reinforce the naval blockade. Do you take the opportunity or do you prefer to go on with your own operations? In Path of Glory, you earn the technical possibility of using poison gas on the front line. Do you do it or not? And finally, in Empire of the Sun, the game uses these cards to simulate that on the other side of the globe, the war in Europe is draining forces and money that you won't have in the Pacific. In short, these cards add depth to the historical narrative. They place your battles in a political, scientific, economic, and social context. Immersion is even stronger because realism is stronger. And that's necessary because by rising to the heights of global strategy, you've lost the easy immersion you had when a token represented a single character. And I can tell you that if you are interested in history, you'll learn things from these games that you wouldn't understand otherwise. With Empire of the Sun, I personally understood the importance of Burma in the conflict. And I also understood the logic behind the famous island-to-island leapfrog progressions because I had experienced for myself in the field that this was the most efficient way. With Path of Glory, I understood the interdependence of war theaters, the Franco-German front, of course, as we know it, but also the Eastern Front, the Balkans, and the Middle East. The First World War was more than just a Franco-German face-off in the trenches. And finally, I felt for myself the headache that was Abraham Lincoln's organization of the Northern armies, who had to improvise his war with what he had, and in particular a handful of incompetent but unfortunately very popular generals. And now, what stories are left to tell? Well, there are sagas even bigger than a world war, and that's the domain of 4X games. 4X, as you know, stands for exploration, exploitation, expansion, and extermination. These are civilization games. We don't tell the story of a group of people, we don't tell the story of a war, we tell the saga of a whole civilization. These are games where you play with centuries and millions of people. And here I have a problem. I like the idea of civilization games, but I have to admit that as soon as you get to these gigantic scales, game designers often turn to abstraction. And as you move towards abstraction, the temptation is great for the designer to introduce one or two Euro mechanisms to make the game a little more fun. And here, you can't see me, but I'm drawing big quotation marks with my fingers around the word fun. Because if you know me, you know how much I hate it when mechanisms take precedence over the story, pulling you out of your imaginary world and bringing you back to the 21st century in your living room around your game table. And after all, there are very few 4X games that really tell a story. Here are two of them. The first one is Space Empires 4X by Jim Crone, published in 2011 by GMT Games, and it's a game of space conquest, a race between 2 to 5 civilizations who must develop in a hostile universe that is totally unknown at the start of the game. And look, the first thing that strikes me about this game is the size of its board. Because yes, if I'm going to tell you a story of space conquest, you want infinite, unfathomable space. Not a game with only 37 hexagons, you see what I mean? A 4X game has to have a big board. And so, to be epic, Space Empires 4X is epic, grandiose. Almost 200 hexagons to explore, a 25-branch techno tree with over 50 skills to develop, over 20 different types of units to build, from large destroyers to light fighters, mine layers, scouts, and ground troops. In short, this is what you want from a 4X game, a feeling of absolute freedom in the direction you want your civilization to take. Not to mention the gargantuan battles and above all a secrecy system that means you don't know your opponent's choices until you've met them. And that's exactly how dangerous it must feel to meet a new alien species in the middle of space. What is their technological level? What are their intentions? And it creates some incredible dramatic twists, not to mention alliances and betrayals. Everything you'd expect from a great story of civilization. And then there's another game that tells a fine story of civilization. It's Conquest of Paradise by Kevin McPartland, published by GMT in 2007. This time the unknown is no longer the void of space, but the Pacific Ocean. And the saga we are about to experience is the exploration of this ocean and its archipelagos by the Polynesian empires around the 5th century. And even if the general principles are very similar to those of the previous game, the story is very different. And we learn a lot about an era and a region we know nothing about. Westerners are not the only ones to have ventured into the unknown across the oceans. And as Polynesian civilizations, we discover the sweet potato in South America and we fight against malaria. In short, a real 4X game, but one that tells an original story, a story to remember. Well, now category number 8, we're starting to get the hang of it, so we can afford a few eccentricities. Because this time we're no longer interested in the stories that are told, but in the people who tell them. And more precisely, in the case of Immersion games, the one who provides us with the narrative toolbox, in short, the game's author. And not just any author, but Phil Eklund, who deserves a category of his own. Well, this picture is pretty, but unfortunately, Bios Origins is not this author's best game, no. Phil Eklund's undisputed masterpiece, let's go straight to the point, is High Frontier. Phil Eklund is a space engineer, and ever since he was a student, he's been playing with the idea of simulating all this science he's so passionate about. To simulate it on paper with a board with tokens and some rules of play. And the result was the first edition of High Frontier in 1999, a game that went through 4 development cycles before blooming in 2020 with High Frontier for All, the 4th version divided into a base game and 4 modules to date. The 5th one has already been announced. High Frontier is a game that doesn't fall into any category. It's a game about scientific wonder. And Phil Eklund's challenge is to put players in the shoes of an engineer, a researcher, and make them feel the thrill of science and technology, the thrill of finally seeing a rocket take off after years of work. In High Frontier, your starting point is a space agency with some crew ready for adventure. And then you rack your brains to build a machine that's powerful enough, not too heavy, and that can hold the equipment you need to analyze the soil and atmosphere once you are there up in the sky. All these must not weigh too much and must withstand cosmic radiation and other solar storms. And then one day, your rocket takes off, and off you go discovering the solar system on the High Frontier wonderful map board. At last, you fly, you cross the Van Allen belt, you change trajectory at a Lagrange point, and finally, you land on Phobos, a satellite of Mars, hoping to set up a base for the conquest of the Red Planet. In short, you can do whatever you like, and you are free to set up the craziest projects. An elevator between Phobos and Mars, or a telescope that uses the sun's gravitational field as an optical lens. And finally, the project we've all been dreaming of, a manned flight that will leave the solar system. In short, High Frontier is a dream factory, a game you think about even when you are not playing it, a board you study for hours trying to discover the best route to the stars. High Frontier is a masterpiece, but it's also typical of Phil Eklund's way of thinking. Phil Eklund is curious. He's interested in everything, and when he comes across a subject, he studies it in depth and asks himself what game or simulation could best tell and share the story behind it. The evolution of early man, for example, with Neanderthal, the development of his brain and his difficult survival in a hostile environment. And Bios Genesis, with an incredible topic. This game tells the story of the birth of life on Earth. At first, players play the roles of chemical compounds, lipids, nucleic acids. Then, they try to settle as best as they can on some prime location like a hydrothermal vent, for example. And then you shape your first cell up to a multicellular creature like this splendid flatworm, provided you manage to get through 1,000 catastrophes, heat strokes, comets and other cosmic rays. And Phil Eklund also knows how to get away from science and tell us about history. And I can tell that thanks to him and his game Pax Porfiriana, I became interested in the Mexican Revolution. If you want to feel the stakes and the chaos of that era, there's no better way than this game. Raids against rival haciendas, assassinations, armed trafficking, unlikely alliances with religions, with the press, with American politicians, or even with the League of Women against alcohol. A time when all moves were allowed, when you could attack your own farms to set yourself up as a victim and win political support. It may look like a simple card game, but it's a real story machine, a splendid narrative sandbox, a pure immersion game. Okay, and you remember that in terms of immersion, I've told you in previous videos about the magic circle and that when you are playing, you should feel immersed in some parallel universe, outer space, the Battle of Waterloo, or some fantasy realm. But the truth is that when we are playing, we're in fact sitting around a table with friends. And the story we are living takes place to some extent in our good old 21st century. So here is the ninth category, event games, where the final story is a clever mix of fiction and reality, a blend of extraordinary adventures and a good weekend with friends. And you might say, wait a minute, Jean-Michel, any game can do that. Try to organize a bridge tournament and you'll see it will be memorable. No, I don't agree. Because don't forget that I'm only talking about immersion games. And these event games that make up my category number 9 are true immersion games. But games that break the fourth wall. Games that step outside the magic circle and invade the player's real world. Let me give you an example to help you understand what I mean. Here I stand, a game by Ed Beach, 2006 GMT Games. 6 players embody the leaders of the 6 great European powers of the Renaissance, Francis I, Henry VIII, Charles V, but also Pope Leo X, Martin Luther, and Suleiman the Magnificent. This game is at once military, religious, cultural, and scientific. We fight for territories, for the control of souls, and for the discovery of the Americas. There's a strong diplomatic dimension to the game, there's a lot of talking, we charm each other, we threaten each other, and suddenly you become your own character. And there's no difference anymore between the game world, the Renaissance, and the room you are sitting in. Do you think I'm exaggerating? Look at this. And even if we don't have to dress up in period costumes, I can guarantee that in our heads and in our discussions, we are there, we are in the Renaissance. The same with War Room, a game by Larry Harris, 2019, from Nightingale Games. This is a team simulation of the Second World War that takes on the appearance of a war room. A gigantic circular world map in the middle of the table, around which you negotiate and decide on operations. You can even use small rakes, just like in the old days. So there's actually a role-playing dimension to this game. It feels even close to a live-action role-playing game. Immersion literally extends beyond the gaming table. And then there's the monster, the Godzilla of immersion games, Mega Civilization 2015. The creation, not to say the creature, of Flo de Haan and John Rodriguez based on Francis Tresham's classic published by Avalon Hill in 1980. A game that simulates the development of great civilizations from 8000 BC to the year 0. And when I say great civilization, I mean from the Celts in Far West all the way to China with 18 civilizations represented, meaning 18 players playing around a 2-meter-long map for over a couple of days. The kind of game you play usually as part of a convention. You lock yourself in and for 2 days you live to the rhythm of the Bronze Age. Wars, trade, volcanic eruptions and slave revolts. And several months later, when players meet up again, they say, "Hi, I'm John." "John, you remember Babylon?" "Ah, Babylon." And without any surprise, for my 10th and last category, I've kept games that are unique. So, this is the out-of-category games category. Not necessarily games that don't belong in any of the above categories, but games that deserve to be treated as unique. And we begin with Root, a game from 2018. It's not that old, it already feels like a classic, by Cole Wehrle, published by Leather Games. And what makes Root so deserving of its place in my top immersion games is that it's built like an author builds a novel or a screenplay. First of all, there's the setting, the universe, the work of the game's second great author, Kyle Ferrin. Look how beautiful that is. And in fact, even if it's not your style, you've got to admit it's unique. The world of Root, from the imagination of Kyle Ferrin, is like nothing we've seen before, especially for a war game, a game of clashing armies. At the very least, we are curious, eager to enter this universe and understand its logic and history. And that's the second strength of this game. This universe has a story. And more precisely, when you start a game of Root, you get the feeling that events have already taken place here just before you begin. At first, there are cat soldiers everywhere. There was a war in this forest before you arrived, a war won by the cats, and now their industry is going to mechanize the whole forest. But, on the other side, there are the birds of prey, and we learn that they are the former aristocracy who have been expelled from the woods and who dream only of returning in force to take back their land and their rights. And then there's the little people who are tired of all this, the little people of the clearings who are so insignificant that we don't even see them on the board. And the most wonderful thing is that I didn't need to read anything to find out about this history, because it's so integrated into the playable factions. You understand the history of this kingdom as you play, without anyone having to explain it to you. And that's exactly what I call immersion, when the game tells its story by itself and not with pages of text to read. And then finally, the effectiveness of Root's narrative is underpinned by a crucial quality. All these factions have a logical, well-defined goal. The cats must industrialize the forest. The lizards must evangelize the people. The bad girls must find sacred relics. Root isn't played to win victory points. Yes, there are victory points, but they are just a tool to measure each faction's progress towards its own goal. So you can compare the evangelization of lizards to the industrialization of cats. And that's where it ends, because when you play, you can forget about it. If you are a cat, you want to cut down trees and build sawmills, that's all. And talking about Root, I'd like to take this opportunity to compare Root to another game that deserves a place in this top 10, Cloud Spire by the Carlson cousins in 2019 from Cheap Theory Games. Because in Cloud Spire, unlike Root, the authors did write pages and pages of background, stories, heroes, and lots of details that have nothing to do with the game. And to be honest, when you open the box, you start reading and then quickly you stop, because you don't want to read stories, you want to live them and play them. So, you play, and you discover the factions and their highly unique styles. The Bromen, nonchalant giants, a people built on stone, builders of towers and fortifications. Nothing to do with the Grege, the swarm of insects that inseminate the earth with larvae and poison the battlefield. And as the game progresses, we become attached to their heroes. Cram the Mighty, Lord of the Bromen, an unwavering force of nature, versus Ekri, the insect queen who feeds on isolated combatants like spiders do. And thus, Cloud Spire demonstrates, since the two can be compared within the same game, that the game itself is far more effective at telling memorable stories than pages and pages of text. And finally, here is the last game on my list, if only one were left. ASL Advanced Squad Leader, a game by Don Greenwood, 1985, Avalon Hill. But this game is still being published and is getting richer every year thanks to Multiman Publishing. ASL is not a game, it's a project. This is a project for a system able to simulate and relive any tactical conflict of the Second World War, street fighting in the hell of Stalingrad, where you have to fight for every yard for every building, a night parachute drop on the Normandy countryside, a beach landing on a Pacific island riddled with Japanese army tunnels, a tank battle in the North African desert, a Polish cavalry charge, a Finnish ski battalion. It's all possible. So, how does it work? ASL includes dozens of boards to represent every possible terrain, every possible theater of operation. Thousands of counters to represent all possible units, armies and tanks that could have been on the road during the Second World War. And of course, an entire binder of rules to simulate every possible situation. Like this rule, for example, explaining how to move through a building on a hillside, or this page that teaches you how to land a glider, or finally, this particular rule that forbids to fire a bazooka from a closed vehicle, but specifies that in desperate cases you can do so anyway at the cost of heavy casualty for the vehicle's occupants. In short, ASL is a game that seems overwhelming, but isn't at all, because in the end, all you ever use at your game table is 1, 2, or 3 boards, a few counters, and a few rules. A game of ASL is a scenario like this one, which sets the historical context and explains the objectives these men had at the time on the battleground. In this example, the day after D-Day, German troops carry out a counterattack to prevent the Americans from using an important road for their logistics in Normandy. Needless to say, you don't need to bother with the rules on ski troops or desert terrain for this scenario. ASL is a toolkit. And just like that, there are hundreds of scenarios for every situation, every difficulty. We'll be fighting to capture a bridge on the Burmese border, or relive a tank duel in the desert. And the level of detail is so high that you're guaranteed a unique experience every time. Anything can happen in ASL. And every time you will be surprised by an extraordinary twist that you remember years later. And that's it. It was long enough, I think. That was my top 10 immersion games. And if that was a bit long, it's because, by way of a top 10, I've presented no less than 33 games, and some of them are series of several titles. But still, I thought it was important to show you what I'm talking about in my videos, and which games I'm talking about. So, of course, there are plenty of other immersion games, and I'm sure you have some in mind that I'd be happy to discover, but may I take the liberty of preempting a comment I'm likely to see quite often? Tell me, Jean-Michel, if you're so keen to live extraordinary stories, to escape into other worlds, why don't you play role-playing games? First of all, yes, I do play role-playing games, but I think that immersion games, such as those board games I introduced, bring something to immersion and storytelling that role-playing games don't have. What am I talking about? Well, that will be the subject of a future video. One step at a time, I'm keeping a bit under wraps. In any case, if there's one goal I was trying to achieve, and I hope I have, it's to prove that mechanisms are not the alpha and omega of board games. You can make a video lasting almost 1 hour, presenting 33 exceptional games without ever mentioning mechanics. So yes, Eurogames, games rich in mechanisms, are also very valid, very intelligent games. But they are not all games. And I hope I've shown you that there's more to board games than these mechanisms heavy top sellers. So, see you soon, folks. You can help me on Tipeee and Patreon if you want to keep the momentum going. In the meantime, get some rest, play lots of games, and if you feel like it, give some thought to what attracts you to games. I'll be happy to discuss it with you. Allez, prenez soin de vous les amis, et à bientôt chez Jean-Michel Grosjeu.